This lecture honors Andrew F. Smith, an SU graduate. Andrew was born in Washington, D.C. in 1963. He's the second son of Dr. David Smith and Mrs. Alice Gillen. He came to Syracuse in 1981, where he studied economics in the Maxwell School. He was also a member of the ROTC and the men's swim team, where he was elected captain in his senior year. After graduating from Syracuse in 1985, Andy worked in the insurance industry. He was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma a few years later, and with the support of his family and his many friends, he fought a courageous battle against the disease. Unfortunately, Andy died on New Year's Day in 1991. Shortly after his death, his brother and sister-in-law, Dr. Michael and Chris Curry Smith, established the Andrew Smith Swimming Scholarship at SU. The fund was used until 2006 to support student athletes on the men's swim team. When the university discontinued the swim program in 2007, the family transferred the funds to the economics department of the Maxwell School to support a lecture series in Andy's name. The first lecture was delivered 2 years ago by Chip Case, a distinguished economist and prominent real estate analyst. And we're very honored to be able to present the second lecture today, and would like to thank Andy's family for choosing to honor him through this gift to the Maxwell School and to the economics department. I'd now like to invite Professor John Yinger to the podium to introduce today's speaker. John Yinger is Trustee Professor of Economics and Public Administration and International Affairs here at Maxwell. Johnny?
So it's a great privilege for me to introduce our speaker today, Edward Glaeser, who is the Fred and Eleanor Glimp Professor of Economics at Harvard University. Professor Glaeser is an academic superstar since receiving his PhD from the University of Chicago in 1992. He's published 10 books, 100 articles in leading economics journals, and 30 book chapters. This research addresses an astonishing range of topics. He's perhaps best known for his research on the economics of cities and regions, and his publications on these topics are a must-read for any scholar who studies housing or interregional migration or urban growth. But he's also written about religion, corruption, hatred, politics, obesity, legal origins, and trust, among many other things. Professor Glaeser is also one of the nation's best-known public intellectuals. He wrote a fascinating column in the New York Times for many years, and his research often appears in the news. This year, the Times had a long article about his recent research on racial residential segregation, and last year, the Times interviewed him about his views on local economic development. I assigned both of these articles to my students, my master's students. Now, part of Professor Glaeser's public appeal comes from the fact that he is an eloquent writer. This is, of course, not a phrase usually associated with economists, but you can read his latest book, The Triumph of the City, which we're going to hear about today, and you can see that this phrase clearly applies to him. Now, I've known Professor Glaeser for a while, and he reminded me a little earlier that we have a common mentor, Professor John Kane, who was at Harvard and then at the University of Texas at Dallas, hired me for my first teaching job at Harvard in 1976, and he hired Ed for his first teaching job at Harvard in 1992. John Kane was an urban economist, one of the founders of the field, and he was a pioneer in thinking about the impact of transportation on urban form and an impact in thinking about the role of residential segregation in cities. Perhaps because of his influence, those are two topics that both Ed and I have worked on for a long time. Ed, for example, has a marvelous book on mathematical models of urban spatial structure. Now, because of its technical nature, I doubt if this book has a wide audience, although I haven't seen the sales figures. But I have to tell you that at least one person, namely me, thoroughly enjoyed reading it, and I learned a lot from it. Professor Glaeser also has a very famous article about the consequences of racial residential segregation, which shows in a rigorous way that segregation contributes to black-white disparities in a very wide range of social outcomes. Now, I have to tell you that Professor Glaeser and I have discussed these things several times, and we don't always agree. But I've always found his research to be thoughtful and thought-provoking, and I've always found him to be much more interested in ideas and evidence than in ideology. And I've enjoyed very much my conversations with him. Now, today's lecture, which draws on his recent book, is called Do Big Cities Make Us Richer, Smarter, Greener, Healthier, and Happier? And it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Ed Glaeser.
Thank you. I'm really terribly honored to be here and terribly grateful to Johnny and Mary for the opportunity to do this and for their very, very kind words. I want to start by reflecting not on cities, but on the extraordinary events that our housing markets have experienced over the past decade, because we really have lived through a whirlwind. What you're looking at here is across metropolitan areas, along the x-axis, is the percent change in prices between 2001 and 2006. I'm sorry the last bit got cut off there. Deflated by the 2001 price. So it's the amount that the prices grew in percentage terms over the first 5 years of the past decade. Along the y-axis is the change in price between 2006 and 2011, deflated again by the 2001 price. So it's percentage, but as a percentage of the original price. Now, normally, housing prices give back some of what they gain. So typically, over a 5-year period, every dollar that a housing price goes up, it gives back 32 cents on that dollar over the next 5-year period. So if an area has been going up in terms of housing prices, don't start thinking to yourself, now's a great time to buy because it'll continue forever, because the norm is that it actually gives back. But this isn't a 32 cents give back. This is actually a 95 cents give back. Right? The coefficient there is minus 0.95. Right? It was a whirlwind that came and went, posing enormous challenges to the American economy, to housing economists who are still struggling to try and make sense of this thing, to indeed all of our hyper-rational models of asset prices. Now, in terms of using the tools of economics to explain this, there are some things that actually work quite well. So a basic tenet in economics is that you'll have more price changes in markets where supply is inelastic, where it's fixed, than in markets where you can build lots of new housing, right? So think about a commodity that's actually completely fixed, like the number of Rembrandts that have been painted, right? You can have booms and busts in the number of Rembrandts, and apart from the occasional forgery, right, there's relatively no new supply of this product, as opposed to, I don't know, the number of Beanie Babies produced by some company, which can be churned out effortlessly at 25 cents a pop. It doesn't matter how big the boom is going to be in this elastically supplied commodity. Now, your prices are going to stay fixed. Now, it turns out housing markets are quite similar to this, that in fact there are housing markets like Silicon Valley, where, because of a combination of rules and geography, they're not building any new homes there, right? And then there are housing markets like Houston, which is basically like the Beanie Baby housing market, where you can build new houses in Houston forever. And in the places that are like Houston, the price growth during the boom was about 28% on average. The price growth in the places that feel like San Francisco was about 93%. So even if we don't understand why the boom happened, we at least have this core logic of elasticity. Now, what are some other facts that we know? This was a Sunbelt boom, right? We're not exactly sure why. Okay, perhaps it is that there's been a long-running demographic trend to the Sunbelt, and people extrapolated from that, thinking that that would mean higher housing prices, although why anyone would think that housing prices in Phoenix or Las Vegas could perpetually move away from supply costs, given that there's no end of land in these places and there's no particular permitting rules. You'd think that that would be Beanie Baby heaven. But in fact, they exploded. Perhaps it's just that irrational exuberance dislikes cold winters. I don't know. But it was strongly associated with the boom. That was not true necessarily in historic periods, but also equally associated with the bust. So this is the decline in over this time period. Now, there are a couple of other messages that you should take away from this, one of which is you should really remember just how heterogeneous this thing was. That there really are some markets like Detroit that really missed out the whole thing, and then there are some markets like Los Angeles that had enormous swings. Now, another thing that actually, and I'm even excluding Las Vegas, another thing is there does appear some correlation between the price growth during the boom and how often people in this area tended to gamble more generally, even excluding Las Vegas. I will read nothing into that. And it's also true that those places that have more Protestants per capita had less of a price boom during the boom period. I again will read nothing into this. It's for your entertainment value. Now the last fact I want to give out is this is looking at the relationship between price growth within the city core and on the city's edge. And one of the things that's notable is actually during this boom, the price growth was actually particularly centered in the city core. But that was even more true when the city core was poor relative to the city edge. It was those places that actually have the poorest central cities that actually had the most centralized price booms during the boom. One hypothesis that may make some sense of this is those are areas that one could imagine the biggest change, transformation in the character of the central city area. Now, it turns out that these factors that explain the boom actually don't have much predictive power in terms of price growth over the decade as a whole. January temperature predicts the boom, it predicts the bust. It has no correlation with price growth between 2001 and 2011. Over the whole decade, you can put together a little model that makes some sense about what happened. And these themes will come back later in the talk. But the starting fact is that the share of the population with more college degrees as of the year 2000, those places, as you had 10% more college graduates among the adult population, you had 15% more price growth over the past 10 years. The power of human capital to guide urban destinies, right? The role that education has will be a running theme of this lecture, and it certainly has continued to be true over the last 10 years. Initial prices, 10% higher initial prices, 1.7% less price growth. Mean reversion, places that start off expensive tend to get a little cheaper. Also, places that started with higher incomes, right? So an extra 10% higher initial incomes meant 2.6% less price growth. Again, this is a mean reversion of income fact. And this is a very common feature across America's cities. This is across metropolitan areas, the relationship between initial median income as of the year 1950 and subsequent change in median income over the next 50 years. There's an enormous tendency of places that are poorer to grow more quickly in terms of income per capita relative to places that are richer. And that's basically what we're seeing again in these recent housing prices. Permitting. The places that are most permissive in their permitting, that make supply easiest, had the least price growth. And finally, and this will be the move into the general part of the talk, as distance to the ocean doubles, price growth falls by 3%. So this was a boom that was over the overall 10 period. The coastal areas did relatively well. I'll just show you. This is the overall model. This is the relationship between predicted price growth and actual price growth. This is notice we missed some significant cities. Detroit did much worse than we would have predicted that it would have. I also was totally, although I've never been accused of being particularly bullish on Detroit. I was certainly shocked that it lost 25% of its population over the last decade. And notice Midland, Texas. Midland, Texas is a big surprise winner over the past decade. Washington, D.C. also does particularly well. Apparently being home to George Bush was a really good thing over the past 10 years. This is the relationship between permitting and price growth. And as you can see, really the fastest price growth was in the places that were permitting the least. This is just as the year 2000, so over the next decade. But really the places that make it most difficult to build are the places that saw that explosion of prices. And this is the relationship. This is actually not the relationship between prices and distance to the ocean. This is population growth and distance to the ocean. Just as prices grew up more quickly in those areas that are on the coast, so did population. So this is ranked counties of the U.S. by proximity to the nearest port. And as you can see, the places that are closest to the nearest port grew much more quickly than the places that are farthest away from it. Now, there's something funny about this, because it's not as if Americans are all working as stevedores in some sort of on-the-waterfront world loading things onto ships. Containerization is still going along apiece. There are fewer and fewer people on the docks. And yet those areas that are closest to ports did well over the last 10 years. And the reason for that is that those ports are the nuclei of the great metropolitan areas that are the economic heartland of America. And this is really the beginning of the talk proper. This is a picture of America, and I call it a picture really to emphasize how completely lacking in any aesthetic sense I am. I've taken the 3,000-odd counties in the U.S., and I've sorted them on the basis of density, people per square mile, because that is at their heart what cities are. Cities are the absence of physical space between people and firms, their density, their proximity, their closeness. And what you can see in the bottom line is the relationship between income and density. And the fact that goes along with this is that the densest tenth of America's counties have per capita incomes that are about 50% higher than the least dense half of America's counties. This connection between density and earnings is sort of maybe the most well-known fact in urban economics. They're typically called agglomeration economies. There are a number of hypotheses for it. It in principle could reflect attributes of an area that attract people and also make them more productive. In principle, it could represent the selection of more able people into cities. There's some truth to both of that, but I think the weight of the past 40 years of evidence in urban suggests that it is really also a treatment effect, that having people around you, particularly skilled people, tends to make you far more productive. And there are other different versions of this fact. So the three largest metropolitan areas in this country produce 18% of America's GDP, while including only 13% of America's population. The top line may be somewhat more surprising. It shows the relationship between population growth and initial population density. So until you get to the top decile, where it turns down slightly, what you see is basically a positive relationship between people per acre, people per square mile, in 2000 and population growth after that decade. So whereas at the start of the 19th century, we were leaving our dense enclaves on the eastern coast to populate the great empty spaces inside America, at the dawn of the 21st century, we're in some sense doing the opposite. Far from populating empty spaces, we're seeing faster population growth in the densest counties in the U.S. And in fact, we're depopulating places like Montana and so forth in the center of the country. This is in some sense the sort of backdrop for the idea of the triumph of the city. It is the notion that our metropolitan areas, our densest counties, are doing remarkably well, measured by population growth, measured by incomes, measured by housing prices. And they really are, in a very real sense, the economic engine of the United States. The connection, of course, between density and incomes does very much reflect the fact that in the last decade, at least, there's been a strong tendency of people to follow the money. Here I've sorted the 3,000 counties into fifths based on initial median income. And as you can see, the population growth in the richest fifth of America's counties is about 15% on average, and the poorest fifth of America's counties lost money. And that's clearly lying behind this attraction of dense areas, although cities, as I will talk to you later, are about more than money. Now, the growth and the importance of cities is significant in America, it's significant in Europe, but it's nothing relative to the transformation that is occurring in the developing world. Right? We have recently passed this momentous halfway point where more than 50% of humanity lives in cities. And I think it's hard not to think that that is on net a good thing, because when you compare those countries that are more than 50% urbanized to those countries that are less than 50% urbanized, the more urbanized countries have incomes that are on average 5 times higher and infant mortality levels that are less than a third, which doesn't mean you should force anyone to live in cities. I'm an economist, for goodness sakes. I believe in choice and freedom and all those things that tend to be built into our core assumptions. But we know of very few paths towards wealth and modernity that don't run through city streets, that don't involve the process of urbanization. And cities throughout the world are often seem to play the role of being pathways out of poverty into prosperity and gateways across continents and civilizations. Gandhi famously said, "The growth of the nation depends not on cities, but on its villages." But with all due respect to the great man, he was completely wrong, right? Because in fact, the growth of India does not depend on its villages. It depends on places like Bangalore. And these are both images of Bangalore. This is the Mindtree campus. So Mindtree is a software consulting company. And from this picture, you don't actually capture the energy of the place, but it's just packed full of people. I mean, on every day, all the software engineers get together on the roof to eat together. And the place is just crowded with genius and intelligence and energy. And it's also a place that's crowded with people from the outside world. Software experts from Silicon Valley, Singapore investors, even the occasional socially awkward Harvard professor. It reminds you that while from an American perspective, Bangalore or Gargan outside of Delhi can seem like the edge of the world, a sort of flat world phenomenon, the place that you call when your Boingo account goes flat. Right? From an Indian perspective, it's the absolute opposite. Right? It's a place that's full of proximity and closeness. It's a place where young software experts come to be around other software experts, to come to learn from one another, which also reminds us that technology is not making face-to-face contact obsolete. It's not making proximity irrelevant. If it was, why the heck would the most famous examples of geographic concentration in the world today, like Silicon Valley and Bangalore, be in the highest tech industries, the places where they should be able to decentralize employment, and yet they're all together eating lunch together on the roof. Next to it is the messy world of Bangalore outside of Gargan and outside of Mindtree. And there are two reasons that I put this up here. One of which is that it reminds us that actually the Mindtree type phenomenon is actually lifting the entire country, but it's doing so messily and slowly. And the problems of the developing world cities are very real. And in no sense do I want to suggest that I am blind to the enormous challenges that the megacities of the world face. These challenges are horrendous. But you don't want to look at the poverty of these cities and say that that's necessarily a sign of urban failure, right? Cities have poor people not because cities are bad for poor people, not because cities make poor people, but typically because cities attract poor people with the promise of economic opportunity, often with better social services. In the U.S., it's also tied to the ability to get around without a car for every adult. All of these things are actually things that cities should be proud of, just as suburbs that make lives impossible for poor people to live should not be proud of their homogeneity, right? Should not be proud of their lack of poverty. But the problems of cities shouldn't make us think that the Indian process is moving from some wonderful bucolic past to a messier world of cities and suffering. Because anyone who thinks that the sort of bucolic past of India or sub-Saharan Africa is, some sort of wonderful thing, clearly has never been to a rural area in these countries, right? Where for thousands of years, people have lived caught in cycles of poverty and deprivation, cycles that don't change, that don't offer a path out. And one way of seeing this, apart from data, things like infant mortality data, is with the happiness data. Now, there is, in fact, I personally would have preferred if the word happier never appeared in my book title, being an economist who tries to avoid saying things about happiness. But and there is no relationship in the U.S. between self-reported happiness and living in a city. After all, what self-respecting New Yorker would admit to some surveyor that they're happy? It's just, go away. But in fact, in the developing world, there's a significant relationship between happiness and urbanization, both across countries and within countries. And the cross-country fact does survive controlling for income, although the effect gets much weaker. And what you're looking at here is self-reported satisfaction, the mean level at the country level from 1 to 10, from the least urbanized to the most urbanized countries. And it's not that people who are living in more urbanized countries in any sense say that they're unhappy about it, or people who live in cities and places like India say that they're unhappy about it. They typically respond that they're more satisfied with their lives than people living in rural areas. Now, in some sense, this sort of positive view of cities presents something of a paradox. We live in an age in which it is effortless to telecommute across the planet, in which we could all just, live in whatever sylvan spot appeals to our biophilia and just dial it in. And yet, in so many ways, in so many places, we don't. We choose proximity. We choose the inconveniences of city life. Why is that? 25 years ago, the cyberspheres and the technoprophets were arguing that this technology would make face-to-face contact in the cities that enable it obsolete. And yet, that does not seem to have happened at all. And that's a paradox, right, that we still cling to each other despite the fact that we can connect on Facebook and Google. And it's a paradox that Google, which of all the companies in the world should be able to work from long distances, right, that they build the Googleplex so they can be right on top of each other. I'm going to return to that paradox later. But I ask you to keep it in your mind. Now, the success of cities today, the very idea of writing a book with the title Triumph of the City, would have been completely unthinkable in the New York City of my youth, right? So I was born in Manhattan in 1967, and these are two iconic images from my childhood when New York was hemorrhaging jobs in the 1960s, right? Don't forget, the largest industrial cluster in the U.S. in the 1950s was not automobile production in Detroit. It was garment production in New York City. And garment production earlier and more devastatingly than automobile production was absolutely pummeled by globalization and the move to lower-cost locales, right? Hundreds of thousands of jobs were lost over a 5-year period in New York City. Accompanying that was a rise of social distress in the city, was a number of significant public problems in terms of and a certain amount of fiscal impropriety, and it led the city to a real fiscal crisis. President Ford did not literally say the words "drop dead to New York City," but I think a lot of people thought he meant it. And indeed, it didn't just feel like President Ford when he was turning down New York's request for a bailout. It didn't just feel like President Ford was telling New York to drop dead. It felt like history itself was telling New York to drop dead, that we would all go back to some sort of Planet of the Apes kind of world. Remember the Statue of Liberty peeking through the sand in New York, and the city would look something like this. As this is Jimmy Carter wandering through the wasteland of the South Bronx, where we really felt as if, just give the thing back to the weeds and nature. This urban model had been tried and found wanting, and it was gone and never going to come around again. And indeed, one of the reasons that it felt as if cities really were finished was that the basic economic function of cities had become largely irrelevant. The function that had brought them about in the 19th century, that had created America's older, colder cities, felt as if it had vanished. Because if you go back wait a minute. There, this is what I wanted. If you go back to the early 19th century, cities, including Syracuse, were part of a great transportation network. So take yourself back to 1816 and think about, the position of America. Here we sat on the edge of the vast wealth of the American hinterland, and yet it was virtually inaccessible. The cost of moving goods 30 miles over land was the same as shipping them across the Atlantic Ocean in 1816. And so we sat perched on the Atlantic seaboard, clinging to our watery lifeline. Over the course of the 19th century, we built this amazing network, first of water, then of rail, and cities rose up at critical points on that network, at pinch points, if you will, at places where you moved the goods from the ships that plied the Great Lakes to the canal boats in Buffalo at the western terminus of the Erie Canal, at Chicago, right, which was the linchpin of a watery arc that went all the way from New York to New Orleans, made possible both by Erie Canal, by Clinton's Ditch, and also, of course, by the Illinois and Michigan Canal, which was the critical linkage between the Chicago River and the Mississippi River system. Right? Chicago, of course, grew up around that. Right? It grew up as part of the rail network that would then enable the cows that were fed in Iowa to be shipped to the east and then slaughtered in Chicago. And industries, of course, all grew up around these transportation networks. It's not an accident that the 20 largest cities in the U.S. in 1900 were all on major waterways, from the oldest, typically where the river meets the sea, like New York and Boston, to the newest, Minneapolis, on the northernmost navigable point on the Mississippi River. And the industries that grew up in cities were very much tied to the port. So think about the three dominant industries in New York City in the 19th century: printing and publishing, the garment trade, and sugar refining. They're all there fundamentally because of the port. Sugar refining is there because of the very considerable trade that New York did, the Caribbean. Now, you can't refine sugar in the 18th century, or in the 19th century for that matter, at the point of production in the Caribbean, because the refined sugar crystals would coalesce during a long, hot sea voyage north. But there still were returns to scale to doing it in a central location, because these were big factories. Just look at the old Domino Sugar buildings in Brooklyn, right? These are big factories. And indeed, so it makes sense to do it in a central location that has access to the port, has access to as many customers as possible. So sugar refining is in New York, and it's New York's largest industry in 1830. And family fortunes like the one that would eventually put Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the White House get their start in sugar refining with old man Isaac Roosevelt, who got involved in politics because he was so annoyed at British mercantilist policies that affected sugar. Garment production as well, huge amount of trade in textiles, and lots of demand both among sailors and among southern customers for ready-made clothes. That's a euphemism for slaves. And then, of course, the printing and publishing, which is my favorite of these stories. The big money in 19th century American printing and publishing was in pirated English novels. Okay? They enjoyed no copyright protection in the U.S. until the end of the 19th century. And so this is what our guys did, right? I mean, no one that American politicians have railed about in the East today who takes liberties with our property rights says anything on what our boys did in the 1820s, right, with Charles Dickens or with Sir Walter Scott. But of course, the problem with pirated novels is you've got to print it first. Right? There's no money in having the 8th pirated edition of Girl with a Dragon Tattoo. Right? You've really got to be the first one to get the thing out. And so that gave the port a tremendous advantage, because the Harper Brothers, New York City's great publishers, could get the latest Sir Walter Scott novel, could get Peril of the Peak, and could print it in 24 hours. Right? Days before it would even show up in the hands of their Philadelphia competitors, Carey and Lee. And this was a huge competitive advantage that the port gave printing and publishing in New York. Chicago's classic industry, of course, is the stockyards. Second largest industry, again, relative to garment production by labor employed, largest industry by value added and capital. The stockyards were part of the American corn network, really. Right? America has always had this marvelous comparative advantage in producing corn, even without the benighted policy of agricultural subsidies towards corn. Sorry, that was an utterly unnecessary editorial aside. And the problem with corn is it's actually a fairly weighty object per dollar value. And the problem is, of course, moving the stuff to market. We originally solved this in the early days with that highly portable and often tasty product of whiskey, right, which is corn, of course, turned into a very movable form. And then in the first half of the 19th century, moved over to pork products. For some reason or other, humans have always tended to prefer salted pork to salted beef, and as such, salted pork tended to dominate the shipping product. And then eventually, we moved to frozen beef when Armour, or more properly the inventor that he employed, comes up with the idea that gives us refrigerated rail cars. And the big genius idea is you put the ice on top of the slaughtered beef instead of below it, so the cold water drips down, keeping the beef cold. And this industry is again part of this. Now, everything that I've described, let's just skip over this, it makes cities sound like they're solving an operations research problem, right? You locate the sugar refinery in the place where you're going to minimize the combination of transportation costs and taking advantage of the scale economies. And there's plenty of truth to this. But that's only one part of how cities work, right? The remarkable thing is when you bring smart people together in dense confines, amazing things can happen as people borrow each other's ideas and learn from one another. This has been happening in cities since Socrates and Plato bickered on an Athenian street corner 25 years ago. And it was happening in Renaissance Florence, with a chain of ideas that starts with Brunelleschi and his ability to understand linear perspective, passes it along to Donatello, who uses that to create a three-dimensional sense to low-relief sculpture on the wall of Orsa Michele, passes it along to Masaccio, who puts it on the wall of the Brancacci Chapel in Florence. 3 dimensions, the ability to have distance, a picture of St. Peter opening the belly of a fish and finding a coin inside, right? One idea borrowing from another, and then Masaccio passes along to his friend and student, that less than saintly monk, Fra Filippo Lippi, right? Passes it along to Botticelli and so forth. Each person borrowing each other's idea, each person creating something bigger. This is what cities do when they really function best. They create these chains of collaborative brilliance that are responsible for humanity's greatest hits, from Athenian philosophy to Facebook. This is something that came out of Chicago in the 1880s. It is often called the first skyscraper, and its architect, William LeBaron Jenney, is often called the father of the skyscraper. Skyscraper being a tall building with a load-bearing steel or cast iron skeleton. Okay? Now, of course, there is a very lively architectural history debate about whether or not this building is the first skyscraper or its architect is the father of the skyscraper, because, in fact, it's not a complete skyscraper. Okay? Only the front 2 walls have a load-bearing steel skeleton. The back 2 walls are traditional masonry walls, right, with the thick walls that are typical of the pre-skyscraper era. If you want to really ever feel what that was like, go to the beautifully renovated St. Pancras Station in London. Right, which really shows you it's a tall building, taller than home insurance was when it was built. Right? Not a skyscraper, massive walls like a medieval fortress, which is what you needed before you had the steel frame. And indeed, there's a good claim that Jenney doesn't deserve this credit, that it should be Louis Sullivan who figured out how to make skyscrapers look like skyscrapers. It should be Daniel Burnham who gave us the Flatiron Building. Or it should be Adler, or it should be Root. Right? There are any number of people in Chicago who have various claims to being, in fact, the father of the skyscraper. But in fact, this quest to find the father of the skyscraper is a fool's errand, because the skyscraper, like pretty much everything else that our species has done since the dawn of time that is worth anything, was a collaborative effort. They all knew each other, for goodness sakes. They all borrowed each other's ideas. They were all working on the same things. They all shared the same engineer, Peter B. White. Right? Sullivan and Burnham were both apprentices in Jenney's office, for goodness sakes. Right? It was a collaborative chain. They did this together. And together, they created this amazing tool for enabling cities to go up that, in some sense, made the elevator the greatest of all the public transportation innovations in cities in the 19th century. Now, a similar chain of innovation occurred 10 years later in Detroit. Okay. So Detroit, classic inland port, right? Detroit, the Straits. And of course, Detroit was going to have industries like Detroit Dry Dock. And this is an image of Detroit Dry Dock, right? This is a firm that specialized in creating boats that would go on the Great Lakes, right? You're solving an operations research problem here, right? You're putting the thing right in the middle of the traffic. But then Detroit Dry Dock serves as an educator for people like this character, the young Henry Ford, who comes to Detroit and gets to start working on engines at Detroit Dry Dock, right? Cities then, as now, serve as forges of human capital. And one of the facts about the urban wage premium is that people who come to cities don't typically see their wages soar up overnight. What they see is year after year, month after month, they experience faster wage growth from being in the city, as presumably they learn from the people around them and learn from borrowing ideas. There's a great phrase of the English economist Alfred Marshall that in dense clusters, the mysteries of the trade become no mystery, but are, as it were, in the air, which really, I think, captures and has captured this for many of us. Now, Ford gets a start there, and then he moves to work with Thomas Edison. And then he goes and enters this great race of American tinkerers of the late 19th century of trying to figure out how to make cars cheap. Now, contrary to what you may have heard in the speech that President Obama gave about why America needed an automobile industry bailout, Americans did not, in fact, invent the car. Okay? This is an important point. The car was actually invented in Germany, not by Americans. But in fact, we did figure out how to mass produce it. And it was not just about Ford, right? The first person to build a car in Detroit is a guy called Charles Kirby. And according to legend, Ford followed Kirby down the streets of Detroit, pedaling furiously on a bicycle, trying to figure out how Kirby's car worked. Now, I suspect this legend is false, right? But I'm repeating it because I love the image of the young Henry Ford frantically using the benefits of proximity to try and figure out how this new innovation operated. Now, of course, it's not just about Ford and it's not just about Kirby, right? If you think about Detroit in the 1890s, it seems like it must have been among the most entrepreneurial place on the planet, with an automotive genius virtually on every street corner. It's about the Dodge brothers, the Fisher brothers, David Dunbar, Buick, Ransom E. Olds, Billy Durant, and nearby Flint, all of whom were working together in one way or another, supplying each other with parts and inputs, or in Fisher cases, the bodies of the cars themselves, right? All of whom are part of this remarkable cluster. And together, they work this miraculous thing of coming up with the big idea, right? The big idea, the big factory, the automated moving, the automated assembly plant, right? That made for Detroit, according to some estimates, the most productive place on the planet in 1950. And $5 days for ordinary workers, tremendous benefit of this, and cheap cars for ordinary Americans, right? As long as they're black. The Ford Model T is running off one after the other, and then of course Sloan makes them multicolored. But the problem with this is that Ford's big idea, while tremendously productive in the short run, is fundamentally not the way that cities work in the long run. It's fundamentally antithetical to what makes cities productive, at least in a regenerative way. So if you think about successful cities at the start of the 19th century, right, they're about small firms, smart people, and connections to the outside world. This is the Birmingham of the age of Bolton and Watt, or the New York in the age of Hamilton, right? Small firms, smart people, and connections to the outside world. The same thing is true today. The same three basic factors are enormously correlated with urban success. How far is that from Ford's River Rouge plant? A vast, vertically integrated plant walled off from the outside world, employing tens of thousands of typically less well-formally educated Americans, right? On a static level, it's great. On a dynamic level, right, this does not need the city. It doesn't connect with the city, right? And when cost considerations change, when Detroit ceases to be the most economically efficient place to make these cars, you move the plant somewhere else. You move the plant to where things are cheaper, right? Because it doesn't actually need the fabric of the city. And of course, things do change. So in 1900, Detroit's access to the waterways gave it a tremendous advantage in terms of bringing in inputs and then shipping the cars. Over the course of the 20th century, transportation costs plummeted. This is the real cost of moving a ton a mile by rail in this country. So it declined by, this one measure, right, which I use because it's standardized, declines by 90%. Of course, hundreds of other things happened in terms of making transportation cheaper as well. Highway system, airplanes, abundant innovations in the transportation sector, so that while in 1920 it made sense to build a factory right outside of Detroit, right, it made good economic sense, by 1960 that logic had lost its power, right, and it made sense to move production to lower cost areas. And indeed the work of Tom Holmes compares counties on opposite sides of a right-to-work border. So you're comparing the pro-union states with the anti-union states that have considerably lower wages. He finds really a radical difference in the growth of manufacturing in the cheaper states in the post-war period, unsurprisingly. And of course, manufacturing then often, particularly labor-intensive manufacturing, leaves the U.S. altogether, right? One way of thinking about the decline in transportation costs is essentially it freed cities up, okay? In 1900, cities formed in places where producers had a natural comparative advantage coming from the innate characteristics of the place, coming from access to the Great Lakes, coming from proximity to a coal mine. As transportation costs plummeted, those advantages became more or less irrelevant. And we increasingly moved to places where people actually wanted to live, which perhaps explains why there's no variable that explains metropolitan area growth, that predicts metropolitan area growth in the 20th century more effectively than January temperature. Okay? Warm Januaries is the single best predictor we have over the 20th century of metropolitan area growth. And one way to see this is a move away from producer cities to consumer cities. Now, the way that economists sometimes get at this is with indices of amenities. And the basic logic of this is this notion of a spatial equilibrium, that you don't get something for nothing at the city level as you don't get something for nothing in many other markets. So if you see a place that has really low housing prices relative to the level of income, something else has got to be wrong about the place. And if you see a place with really high housing prices relative to income, something's got to be right about the place. So you can then use the relationship between income and housing prices to figure out how high are the amenity levels in this area? How pleasant is it? And this kind of logic reveals a ranking like this. So these are the places on your left-hand side that have the highest amenity indexes measured by high housing prices relative to incomes as of the year 1980. As you can see, 9 of them are in California, and the other one's Honolulu. Okay. Now, I'm not personally too crazy about these places, but I understand I'm an outlier on these areas. The other places, now there are probably some problems with the Connecticut towns, because in terms of mismeasurement of wages for this group. But the other ones are sort of a rogues gallery of American metropolitan areas. Some are too cold, some are too hot, some have other issues that are going on with them. And when you use this index between 1980 and 2000, you see that these amenities are fairly strong predictors of which areas have grown. Again, you can think about this as America moving from areas like Detroit that once had a productive advantage to areas where people actually wanted to live, like those retiring Midwestern farmers who moved to Los Angeles at the start of the 20th century. So just as we remade our large urban system, we also remade the microsystem of each city. We have always built our urban spaces, and this is a very big John Kane point, around the transportation technology that was dominant in the era in which the city was built. Think about the oldest part of European cities, or New York City, or Boston, right, that were built around pedestrians, sometimes goats too, but short blocks, narrow streets. They wind sometimes, mirroring the way that people walk, right? And then look at the areas that are gridded, laid down in the early 19th century, typically around wheeled transportation, and then, of course, the omnibus, right? Think about the sort of the northern part of Manhattan built on the 1811 grid. And then think about the streetcar suburbs that are built around the early forms of rail, or the main line of Philadelphia built around steam travel. All of these things were sprawl in their era. Each new transportation technology called forth a transformation, enabled the city to grow larger, and also changed the way we lived. The car did the same, but it did so more radically because all of these older forms of transportation innovations were hub and spoke, meaning you still had to walk from where the place dropped you off to your final destination, which kept densities reasonably high. Right? You might be able to go to Upper Manhattan on the rail car, but you still got to walk to your apartment once you get there. Cars are point to point. They enable huge amounts of space to separate us, and they also, of course, require huge amounts of space in operation. And so we rebuilt our spaces around the car, often in great mass-produced ways. The top image is Levittown after World War II, which was a mixed model, in fact, which had access to public transit, but also very much accommodated the car. The bottom is a more modern version. The woodlands outside of Houston, very lush, very car-oriented living, providing housing that's very, very cheap relative to a New York or Boston standard, but doing so in a very car-oriented lifestyle. Now, it's easy to understand why Americans chose the car. The average commute by car in this country is 24 minutes. The average commute by public transit is 48 minutes because there's a 15 to 20-minute fixed time cost that's involved every time you're going to the public transit and then going away from it. But, of course, we also should ask why exactly we see fit to subsidize highways so strongly. And this has particularly come out in the president's recent budgets, that both in the stimulus and in recent budgets, there's been a strong push to subsidize infrastructure. And what infrastructure means, overwhelmingly in this country, is highways. Right? That's actually what this means. And the formulas, which are worked out, of course, to handle the Senate, meant that our infrastructure spending was twice as high on a per capita basis in our least dense states than it was in our most dense states. The least dense states, of course, are very well endowed with senators per capita relative to the most dense states. The highway system, of course, had a huge impact on the development of our cities. The work of Nathaniel Baum-Snow at Brown shows that each new highway that cut into an urban core after 1950 reduced the central city's population by about 18% relative to the metropolitan area as a whole. Now, hit by the move to sun and sprawl by deindustrialization, almost all of our older cities experienced significant decline. These were the 10 largest cities in the U.S. in 1950. Now, often I've been mixing up cities and metropolitan areas in different areas. Here I'm actually talking about cities as cities. 8 of these 10 lost 20% or more of their population over the next 50 years, and 3 of them lost 48% more of their population, right? Incredible declines, and indeed, social distress was accompanying this suburbanization and the declines in economic well-being. This is Detroit's 1967 riot, right? An image very much that suggested that civilization, which was itself born out of cities, had left those urban areas. Now, the federal government didn't exactly help matters. In the 50s and 60s, we followed urban renewal policies that subsidized new construction in these areas. After the 1973 Federal Highway Aid Act, we sat there subsidizing public transit systems in cities. One way to see these policies is they were essentially a Potemkin village strategy towards our cities that forgot that the real heart of the city is always the people, not the structures, not the infrastructure. And it forgot the fact that declining cities are abundantly blessed with housing and infrastructure, right? Detroit was built for 1.85 million people, right? More than 90% of the homes in Central City Detroit are valued significantly below the physical construction costs, right? If they fell down, no one in their right mind would put them up again. It could not have made sense either today or in the 1960s to subsidize the construction of new housing, and yet people build Renaissance centers because it's a shiny, glassy thing. That's actually a private piece of folly rather than a public one. And of course, after the Federal Highway Aid Act, they built a monorail in Detroit, okay? Now, notice the monorail is gliding over essentially empty streets, okay? Now, it's easy to get around in Detroit because it's a city built for 1.85 million people that now has less than 800,000. You don't need a monorail. It's like a Simpsons episode, for goodness sakes. And the monorail is, of course, deeply empty. This was another big point of our mentor, John Kane, of emphasizing the enormous folly of subsidizing many of these rail systems. And the work of Nate Baum-Snow and Matthew Kahn really shows this. Part of the problem is that you actually didn't need this because these cities were actually connected. So whereas highways had a huge impact on previously inaccessible suburbs, cities actually were connected with other forms of public transit. So what this does is it looks at, depending upon your initial distance from the public transit system, it looks at the impact of changing the distance on the share of the people who commute using public transit. So what they find is if you start out, let's say, 3 kilometers from the public transit system and then you eliminate all that distance, how much does that change the share of your population that commutes using public transit? 2%, okay, a little under 2%. Tiny effect. Do the same thing for 6 kilometers, get rid of the whole thing, 3.5%, right? These transit systems just didn't have a huge impact on the way people lived in terms of getting to work. Now, while Detroit, the story is not, the story is not over, the story is still not happy, although I certainly wish Mayor Bing all the luck in the world. Other cities did come back. And it's easy to forget how similar these cities looked 40 years ago. So in 1971, 2 real estate jokers put up a sign outside of Chicago asking the last person to leave the city to please turn out the lights, okay? Because Boeing had been cutting down on its employment. And just like, GM cutting down its jobs in Detroit, who could imagine a Seattle with a smaller Boeing? It couldn't possibly happen. Before Microsoft, before Starbucks, before Costco, Starbucks, I guess, was the faint whiff of an aroma in a coffee roaster's nose. Without Amazon, right? All of these things came about and changed the city. Right? Boston was awful in the 70s, right? Boston had huge problems during the 1970s, and yet it feels nothing like either Detroit or what it was like in the 1970s. Right? Boston's rebirth is very closely tied to industry education links. These are images of two major connectors between particularly MIT and the outside world. This is Vannevar Bush, father of Raytheon, also the person who who was a mentor to the young Fred Terman, who would later go on to found Stanford Industrial Park, someone who really sort of pioneered MIT's move into technology. This image is the only non-copyrighted image I could find of Arthur D. Little, the founder of the Arthur D. Little Consulting Company, who was an MIT chemist. It's actually, of course, the building called the Arthur D. Little Building in MIT's campus. But he built the first research lab for General Motors in 1905, and was part of this sort of move into commercialization of the technologies that were being developed at schools. There's an old line of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, which is that the best way to ensure a world-class city is to found 2 world-class universities and wait 50 years. And the work of Enrico Moretti at Berkeley really does seem to support this. I mean, his own work looks at having a land-grant college prior to 1940 and shows that it has a remarkably positive effect on both wages, and I guess my own work using this on population growth over the last 20 or 30 years. MIT is, of course, Boston's land-grant college. Now, New York's experience is very much tied to finance. At its height in 2008, 44% of the payroll on the island of Manhattan was earned in finance and insurance. It is very natural that finance is in cities. Because if you think that what cities are best at in the modern world is enabling the spread of information, enabling people to learn from one another, there's no industry where a little bit of extra information or a little bit of extra knowledge is worth more than in finance, right? Which makes it very natural that finance continues to cling to cities. One way to tell the story of finance in New York is the story of a chain of innovation that starts with a more sophisticated ability to think about the trade-offs between risk and return, probably most closely in the University of Chicago and the connection between Jimmy Savage and Milton Friedman and the young Harry Markowitz. This then gets carried by people like the young Fisher Black and the young Jack Traynor to Wall Street. That ability to think quantitatively about risk and return that enables the young Michael Milken to convince investors that his high-yield debt junk bonds carried enough return to offset the risk. He did that, of course, quantitatively. That high-yield debt then enables the young Henry Kravis to engage in larger and larger leveraged buyouts. Lou Ranieri, who got a start in the mailroom with Salomon Brothers, reminding us of cities' enduring ability to act as places of entrepreneurial learning, also is part of this. And, of course, so is Michael Bloomberg. Now, when I wrote the book, I was not an employee of Bloomberg View. I am now, which is both a form of disclosure, but it's also advertising, of course. I'm every other week on Tuesday. But I keep this image up here because Bloomberg is really an example of three things. One of which is he's part of this chain of innovation, right? He's part of this financial quantitative thing that New York did because his terminals are a critical part of making the data available to make use of this. Second thing he's an example of, though, is the enduring ability of cities when they work to enable cross-industry fertilization. This is an idea that Jane Jacobs in her book, The Economy of Cities, was very big on. Bloomberg is not a financial billionaire, right? He's an IT billionaire. Right? He specializes in delivering data services, right? Much like the guys in Silicon Valley do. But he's able to succeed in a way that no one living in splendid isolation in Atherton could possibly do because he's run the trading floor at Salomon Brothers, because he's run their tech operation. And when he gets pushed out in a palace coup of Salomon Brothers to start his own and goes to start his own company, he knows something that those guys don't know because the city has educated him, because he's acquired this experience. He's able to see an opportunity in a different industry because he's acquired the knowledge that the city has brought him. Now, there's a third point about this, though, that the reason why I keep the image. This is the bullpen at City Hall, a Wallace office that was patterned on the bullpen at Bloomberg LLP, which is patterned on the Salomon Brothers trading floor, right? Crowded place, no walls. Now, when you think about it, there's something odd about trading floors. Here you have some of the wealthiest people on the planet who in a normal industry would sit protected by oaken desks and oaken doors, having personal assistants, making sure that they're enjoying all the perquisites of privacy that their wealth has made possible for them. And yet here they are, right on top of each other, sweating on each other, getting guacamole on each other, right? They're right next to each other, right? Why are they doing this? They're there because they need to know what's going on. They're there because information is so valuable in this industry. They're there because knowledge is more important than space. And that is fundamentally why cities also came back, right? This bullpen, like the trading floor, is fundamentally the city's writ small, right? Cities came back because knowledge is more important than space, because people were willing to put up with the inconveniences of city life because, in fact, the returns to being in the mix of the flow of ideas were so high. And this is the answer to our paradox, right? Why globalization and new technologies have not made cities obsolete. And in fact, it made them stronger because these trends have only increased the returns to being smart. They've increased the new returns to new innovation, and they've increased the complexity of the world because you can sell it on the other side of the planet, because you can source it on the other side of the planet. And as the returns to knowledge became more important, the advantage of being in a smart city grew more important because we fundamentally are a social species that gets smart by being around other smart people. This is what cities do that matters, right? And as the world prized information more, also the returns to cities became higher as well. If anyone who's ever taught knows the hard part about teaching is not having your script. It's knowing whether or not anything you're saying is getting through, right? That's the difficult part. And we have evolved over millions of years to have these wonderful cues for communicating comprehension or confusion that you lose when you're not in the same room. And the more complicated the idea is, the more critical those cues are. The more valuable it is to be right next to each other on the trading floor instead of trying to dial it in. It's not as if you can't do a lot of telecommuting for routine tasks. It's not as if you can't have call centers in the middle of nowhere, but you're not going to learn the same amount, and you're going to have a larger risk that some really complicated idea is going to be lost in translation while you're doing it. In some sense, cities continue to be important because they play to our greatest asset, which is our ability to learn from the people around us. The fact that we come out of the womb with this remarkable ability to soak up information from our parents, from our peers, from our siblings, even occasionally from our teachers. And this is what makes cities so, so valuable and so successful. Now, of course, it's not all cities, right? And that's we saw in the Detroit, the Seattle distinction, right? It's particularly those cities that are idea-oriented. And if you want to choose a proxy for what explains which ones of the older, colder cities did well, the best thing to focus on is the long-term educational base of the city, right? 11%, 12% of Detroit's adults have a college degree. This is the central city. More than 50% of Seattle's do, right? This is a very good variable predicting it. This is across the U.S., the relationship between share of the population with a college degree as of the year 1970 and subsequent population growth. As you can see, it's a nice, robust, positive relationship. But it's nothing like this one. This is the same figure, but I've restricted it to those metropolitan areas in the Northeast and the Midwest. Right? Population growth less than 10% for the least educated quintile and over 50% for the most educated quintile. Extraordinarily strong relationship between skills and success. And this is about many things, obviously. It's about skilled entrepreneurs. It's about skilled industries. But this is really the critical variable, and that's why, of course, this land-grant college variable is so powerful. This is data that was not in the book because it wouldn't have been available. This is skills and population growth across counties in the U.S. over the last 10 years. Right? This relationship is in no sense changing, and we saw this earlier in terms of the skills relationship with housing price growth. Skills are, of course, predicting population growth because they're so powerful in predicting income. This is the relationship across metropolitan areas between per capita GDP and the share of the population with college degrees. Again, an unbelievably tight relationship. This is, and it's much stronger than the relationship that would just be predicted by the personal level of skills. This is something that economists call human capital spillovers, the advantage of being around other skilled people. And this comes out of work that was originally done by Jonathan Rausch, and then later Moretti's work is tied to this. What this is it's, Johnny alluded to the eloquence of economists. This is something we call the log wage residual. So what this is we take your wages, we control for your years of schooling, and then we average it up at the metropolitan area level. That's along the x-axis. And along the y-axis, and then the share of the metropolitan area's workers who are above the age of 25 who have college degrees. And what you can see here is that on average, as the share of the population with a college degree increases by 10%, your wages go up by 8%, holding your years of schooling constant. So really having skilled neighbors is incredibly valuable. The relationship in other countries that we've looked at is vastly stronger than this. So in India and China, enormously strong relationships between having skilled neighbors and economic growth. And one of the reasons why historical skills are so powerful is there's been a very strong connection between the change in the percent of the population with college degrees and the initial share of the population with college degrees. So this is the share of the population with a college degree as of 1940. This is the change in the percentage of the population with college degrees between 1940 and 2000. So whereas income showed this incredible mean reversion, that the higher income places had much slower income growth than the poorer places did, in college degrees it's exactly the opposite. The most skilled places had by far the fastest growth in this. Now, while formals, it's nice to think, particularly of those of us in the education industry, that formal skills matter. Surely the most important skills that are imparted in cities are those that are learned on the streets every day, the implicit things that are picked up at work. And it's hard to think that there's anything more important in terms of these implicit skills than the knowledge and inclination to be an entrepreneur. 50 years ago, the economist Ben Chinitz compared New York and Pittsburgh and noticed that even in the 1950s, New York was appearing to be far more resilient than Pittsburgh. Chinitz argued that this was because New York had a culture of entrepreneurship inculcated by its industrial past. So I've already mentioned New York's connection with the garment industry, and one of the wonderful things about the garment industry was it was an industry with very few barriers to entry. Anybody with a good idea and a couple of sewing machines could get started selling something, right? And this made it very much a mother of entrepreneurship, a place where people learned themselves getting started in entrepreneurs, and also, trained entrepreneurs at the breakfast table. In the book, I tell the story of A.E. Lefcourt, who built more skyscrapers in New York than any other person did prior to 1929, until he famously declared that 1930 was going to be the greatest of all building years, showing an exuberance that is not unknown in the development industry. He got his start in the garment trade, as indeed did, say, the father of Sanford Weill, later of Citigroup. Now, whereas New York had the garment industry, which may have bred entrepreneurs, Pittsburgh had U.S. Steel, right? U.S. Steel, again, vast vertically integrated company. And the middle managers at U.S. Steel
wouldn't have had the foggiest idea about how to start some new enterprise if steel went south, no more than the middle managers at GM would. But the garment guys would. The garment guys are perfectly happy looking for opportunity. That's what entrepreneurs do. And this, at least, is one explanation of one other thing that's missing in terms of understanding urban success. Now, we have fairly crappy measures of entrepreneurship, which makes it all the more remarkable that they're as powerful as they are in predicting local success. So one of the ways we measure it is the share of the population, share of employment at some initial year in startup firms. Another way we measure it is just average establishment size. So we say smaller firms mean more entrepreneurs per capita than larger firms. This is the relationship between average establishment size in 1977 and subsequent employment growth. 3 times higher in those metropolitan areas with the smallest average establishment size than in those areas with the largest establishment size, right? Small firms, may be far less productive in the short run, but they do appear to be very resilient and able to produce things. There's a lot of statistical work that shows how robust this is, okay? You can use mines as a source of exogenous variation. Mines predict having larger firms, even outside of the Rust Belt, and those places that were close to mines in 1900 had larger firms today and have done less well in recent years. Done, okay. Now, the most entrepreneurial place I've ever been is the Dharavi slum in Mumbai. Right. You walk around Dharavi and you see in one corner there are a couple of guys sewing brassieres, and you feel like you're in the lower side of Manhattan in 1905. And then across the street from there, there are these women sitting on the floor recycling plastics, although you do worry slightly about those syringes being recycled. And then a little bit further down, there are guys who are recycling boxes, which means chopping them open and turning them inside out so you can't see the old labels. That's a recycled box. Opportunity. How would I have known that there was this opportunity? But they knew. They're in the middle of this amazing metropolitan area. And you go a little bit further down, and there are guys who are making, there's a cluster of ceramics production, where they're making these beautiful little pots, and they're too proud to even take any money from you. Right? A remarkable place in terms of just feeling the energy and the optimism that's possible in India, this place that's so full of human talent. And yet, of course, you go out in the street, and there's a kid defecating on it. And the street isn't paved, and the water is unsafe. And it reminds you, right? It reminds you that cities have enormous challenges as well as assets. That if 2 people are close enough to give each other an idea face-to-face, they're also close enough to give each other contagious disease. And if someone's close enough to sell you a newspaper, they're also close enough to pick your pocket, right? These are the negative externalities, if you will, of cities. And cities for thousands of years have been dealing with the downsides of urban density, of dealing with the demons of putting a lot of people on a small amount of land. In some sense, one way to think about this is an abundance of land hides many sins, right? But when people are close, you really do need government. There's a reason why people in New York City like government more than people in Montana do. They need it more, right? People in cities need it more. Now, the most important thing that city governments do is deal with clean water and sewage. Okay? Because if you don't, people die in large quantities. Right? A boy born in New York City in 1900 had a life expectancy that was 7 years less than the national average. Today, life expectancies are almost 3 years longer in New York City than in the nation as a whole. No one actually quite understands why life expectancies are higher in New York. I've spent a fair amount of time with the data convincing myself that it's not all selection. It's not just healthier people who are staying in the city. Among older people, there are hypotheses like more walking and more social connection. But nobody really knows. Among younger people, though, it's really easy to see why death rates are lower in New York. 2 of the leading causes of death for people under the age of 45 are motor vehicle accidents and suicides. Motor vehicle accidents are it's just a whole lot safer to get into a subway after a few drinks than it is to get behind the wheel of a car. Not that I'm recommending either. But, and of course, the other fact that's quite striking is the suicide rates, which are so low in the city. One hypothesis is that this has to do with widespread gun availability. The work of mine with David Cutler finds that there's a very strong relationship between hunting licenses per capita and rates of teen suicide across counties within the U.S., which may well suggest that the sort of lack of gun culture, at least in some of our metropolitan areas, has something to do with low levels of younger teen suicide, but nobody really completely knows. New York, of course, didn't become safe by accident. It required enormous investments, as was true throughout the cities, and that's indeed the challenge that is facing the developing world megacities today. These infrastructure investments that are needed to make cities safe are not cheap. America's cities and towns were spending as much on clean water at the start of the 20th century as the federal government was spending on everything except for the post office and the army, according to work by David Cutler and Grant Miller. Right? Now, cities tried to do it on the cheap, and it didn't work out. So these 2 are, of course, 2 of America's founding fathers, Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. And Burr would later shoot Hamilton on the shores of the Hudson. But before Burr shot Hamilton, he hired him to be his lawyer. Because Burr had a scheme of having a water company come bank in New York City. Now, Burr wanted a bank, and New York needed clean water. It's not quite clear why they intuited after the yellow fever epidemics of the 1790s that cities needed to have better water, but that certainly seemed to be the public policy consensus. Now, Philadelphia went a purely public route with Latrobe and the Philadelphia Water Works that appeared to be reasonably successful. New York went this other way because Burr had this scheme that they were going to have this public-private partnership, sort of a private water company that was going to be subsidized with the ability to run a bank. So he hires Hamilton, and Hamilton goes to his Federalist buddies on the city council and convinces them that having a public water system will lead to, this is the exact quote, burthensome taxes. Okay, it will lead to burdensome taxes to have public water. So, the Federalists go along with it, and Burr gets his public water company. And to anyone trained in even the slightest bit of incentive theory, this thing is nuts, right? You can have private water provision, right? But you don't incentivize, you don't create a system where you're trying to get a guy to do a relatively non-remunerative activity, like provide clean water, by allowing them to do an alternative, highly lucrative activity. Right? We should be able to predict exactly what should happen. This entity should do a lot of banking and no water provision, since there's basically very little money in this water business. And indeed, that's what happened. This is the water company, right? J.P. Morgan Chase, which was the Chase Manhattan Bank, which was the Bank of the Manhattan Water Company. Now, it is not true, it is an urban myth, but you can read it on Wikipedia anyway, that this octagon is the cross-section of a water pipe. That is, in fact, not false. But as long as you remember that that is, in fact, false. But as long as you remember that it's false, it may help you as a mnemonic to keep track of what the origins of J.P. Morgan Chase was, which always did very well in banking and didn't do a lot of water provision. In fact, New York doesn't get clean water until they spend an enormous amount of money on the Croton Aqueduct, piping in water from lower density areas. Now, some problems, like clean water, involve an overwhelmingly engineering solution. Other ones, like traffic congestion, do not. You can't just build your way out of traffic congestion. There's something that's called the fundamental law of highway congestion, which is associated with the economists Gilles Duranton and Matthew Turner, who have found that highway miles traveled increase roughly 1-for-1 with highway miles built. Right? That vehicle miles traveled increase roughly 1-for-1 with highway miles built. If you build it, they will drive. Right? This means that you can't just build your way out of traffic congestion. Right? You need to actually start charging people for the social costs of their action, like the congestion that they create by using crowded city or highway streets. Now, Singapore has had congestion pricing inspired by the economist Bill Vickery for the last 30 years, and it works remarkably well. Here we are in the second densest country in the world, where the cars are moving swiftly around the city because they've got the electronic road pricing that is charging differential prices based on the level of traffic and actually charging people for the use of the city streets. In some sense, the U.S. strategy is basically running a Soviet-style transit policy in our cities. And by that I mean the old Soviet Union used to charge below market, significantly below market rate prices for basic groceries like eggs and milk. And unsurprisingly, the result was long lines and stockouts, right? Because you weren't charging people for the social cost of their action. You weren't charging people the market price. Now, that's exactly what we're doing with city streets. We're not charging people to use this valuable asset, and the result is long lines and stockouts, otherwise known as traffic jams. Okay, now, cities can, if they deal with the demons of density, become places of enormous pleasure. And I mentioned earlier this concept that high real wages, having high wages or low prices relative to wages, is not always good. It also can be a sign that something's wrong, because there's no such thing as a free lunch. Now, if you go back to 1970, this is the relationship between real wages and city population. And what you notice is that bigger places had higher real wages. Go forth to 2000, no longer true. Does this mean that something bad has happened to cities? No. Exactly the opposite. It means that something good has happened to cities. Because the logic of this is that in 1970, you had to pay people combat pay for putting up with the mean streets of New York or Chicago. Right? In 2000, people are willing to accept a real wage discount to enjoy the pleasure of living in New York. That's why there's so many reverse commuters today as opposed to the 1970s who are willing to put up with New York. And it's not as if this change is because nominal wages have gone down. It's not as if these places have become less productive. It's that high housing prices went up so radically in these areas because people were willing to pay for the premium of being in these cities that it had become fun as well as productive. Because the same urban density, the same urban entrepreneurship that makes cities amazing places to have biotech firms and financial firms also makes cities a great place to eat out. Right? And the urban economies of scale also make it possible to have large museums or entertainment venues. And of course, the best thing about cities is they connect people, which is why cities are full of young single people, because the great asset of the great thing desired by young single people is other young single people, and of course cities make that easier. Now, the downside of all this success is that if cities don't build, if places don't build in a way that's commensurate with demand, they risk becoming boutique towns affordable only to the wealthy. And what you saw in New York over the last 40 years, the declining line is the number of permits, the rising line is price. So just as New York is becoming more attractive, the city allows less and less building. This is the zoning code of 1961. This is the increasing number of historic preservation districts. 15% of the land in Manhattan, south of 96th Street, exclusive of Central Park, is now in a historic preservation district. Right? That's an enormous amount of the prime residential real estate in the city. And this is really what Jane Jacobs got wrong. I mean, there's so much about cities in which Jane Jacobs is just a peerless analyst. But she looked at old buildings, and she noticed that old buildings were cheap. And she looked at new buildings, and she noticed that new buildings were expensive. And this led her to conclude that the way to make sure that cities stayed affordable was to make sure that no one replaced old buildings with new buildings. Okay? That is not how supply and demand works. Okay? If you have an area for which there's abundant demand, the only way to keep prices down is to enable there to be more supply, more square footage. And indeed, you need look no further than in her own home district of Greenwich Village, which she fought so hard to have made into a historic preservation district. Right? It's been frozen in amber for 40 years. And the result has been a place where townhouses start at $5 million and hedge fund managers only need apply. Compare it, for example, with the lakefront of Chicago, where Mayor Daley has unleashed the cranes for 20 years, and it is a place in which there's not just prime real estate that is far more affordable than it is in most cities of the world, but also the real estate throughout Chicago gets more affordable because the supply sates the level of demand. This is an issue in New York City. It's far more tragic in the developing world. Mumbai has labored on a 1.25 floor area ratio. That means an average height of 1.25 for much of the last 40 years, right? Leading the city to be tragically low, tragically sprawling. And when you do have tall buildings, they're built with so much green space around it, it makes it impossible to have a walking city. And as a result, you have a city with a very dysfunctional public transit system that is failing to play its role in helping India transform itself because of just bad urban planning. Bad urban planning that is really vastly over-restrictive of development. Now, one of the last reasons that there's a case to be made for cities enabling themselves to grow up is that cities also have a certain amount of environmental role. And I want to end by telling a story of a young Harvard graduate who, a beautiful spring day in 1844, went for a walk in the woods outside of Concord. And he did a little fishing, and the fishing was good because there hadn't been much rain lately. But when he came to cook the fish into a chowder, that's what we do in Massachusetts, we cook chowders, the wind flicked the flames to the nearby dry grass, and a fire started, and it spread, and it spread. And by the time it was done, this young man had burned down more than 300 acres of prime Concord woodland. In his own day, he was castigated as an enemy of the environment. The Concord Freeman called him a flibbertigibbet, which I think was pretty bad for 1844. And indeed, it's hard not to think that they were right. It's hard to think of any young man living in Boston or Cambridge who did as much damage to the environment as this guy did. Right? Now, of course, today, he is venerated as the secular saint of American environmentalism. He is Henry David Thoreau, whose book Walden teaches a gospel about what a great thing it is to live surrounded by nature. But his own life seems to preach a very different moral, right? His own life seems to remind us that we are a very destructive species, and often the best thing to do if you love nature is to stay away from it, as indeed Thoreau would have done a great deal of good to the birds and flowers and whatnot outside of Concord if he had stayed home instead of going burning up the whole place. Now, indeed, there is a fair amount of data that goes along with this. But together with Matthew Kahn, I've tried to estimate the carbon emissions associated with living in different parts of the country for a standardized household based on income and family size. And what we've tended to find is that there are very dramatically lower carbon emissions associated with city living rather than living in places like the area that Thoreau lived and, again, fully disclosing, and near where I lived, because I, too, when I started acquiring small children about 6 years ago, only economists talk about acquiring small children. I moved to an area not far away from Thoreau's place and started doing almost as much damage to the environment as he did. And it's primarily about longer commutes, particularly longer driving, and about larger homes, even holding family size constant, which means larger levels of home heating and home energy. One way of thinking about this is that if the great growing cities, great growing countries of India and China see their per capita carbon emission levels rise to that seen in the United States, global carbon emissions go up by about 130%. If they stop at the level seen at hyper-dense but still wealthy Hong Kong, they go up by less than 30%. Right? Significant difference in this, which is not to say that the U.S. should be in any sense in the business of restricting where people live, right? This is not, I believe in choice. I believe there's a glory of America that we have the ability of people to live in different areas. But we should at least rethink those policies that stack the deck against our urban areas. We should rethink policies that are subsidizing highways, in lower density areas and higher density areas, right? There's no reason why that form of transportation shouldn't be paid for overwhelmingly by user fees. We should rethink policies like the home mortgage interest deduction that bribes Americans to leverage themselves to the hilt to bet on the vicissitudes of the housing market, and also bribes them out of urban apartments into suburban homes. There's a very strong connection between structure type and ownership type. More than 85% of single-family detached houses are owner-occupied. More than 85% of multi-unit units are rented. If you're going to act as if the only way to achieve the American dream is to own, you're basically telling people to move out of high-density living. And in the wake of the great housing convulsion of the last decade, with which I began this talk, I think a policy of bribing Americans to borrow as much as possible to bet on housing just seems absolutely nuts. But the last point I want to make is I think the biggest challenge that our cities face, and the most intractable one, right, is the problem of city schooling, right? Because it really is human capital that's the bedrock of our cities and of the nation. And the problem is, of course, enormously difficult. We've had some helpful, some heartwarming results, at least for some charter schools. But this problem has proved enormously difficult. We've had just huge amounts of talent. People like Joel Klein, who I just have enormous admiration for his energy and passion. And he did everything that that the experts all thought was right, and yet he moved the dial very, very little. And yet it's just, it's an enormous tax on cities that people feel like they have to move to suburban areas to get better schools. And it's just an enormous, sense in which we're failing the young people of America by failing to do this. And that certainly is the largest, I think, policy challenge going forward. But let me not end on that, that relatively unhappy note. The larger message here, right, is that we as a species, when we are connected by cities, have been working miracles for the last 3,000 years. Right? And no matter how things look difficult, whether or not it's in the issue of climate or the issue of urban schools, our track record, right, the track record of all of us when we come together is just spectacular. And I think I cannot but think about that and think of the amazing things that cities have achieved, that we have achieved in cities, right, without continuing to be enormously hopeful for our future going forward. So fundamentally, if cities have triumphed, it's because humanity has triumphed. And it's because we have just, when we take advantage of our connections to each other, we have this remarkable capacity to do good. And I have every faith that that will continue. Thank you. I think we have time for some questions, right? So I can. Do you want to call it? Do you want? I can. Yeah, I'm going to do it.
Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful presentation, Professor Glaeser. One other challenge faced by a developing country for urbanization is the space. It's very limited, mostly because they cannot go up to, like, when they're building buildings, they cannot go up then a certain level. So what do you suggest to those countries, especially, I'm talking about the developing countries?
Yeah. So I think in the case of developing world countries have a number of different problems. I mean, fixing the zoning code in Mumbai would be a step forward. It's not going to fix the problems of the urban poor in Mumbai. It's just low-hanging fruit. It's just the current system is idiotic, not to use too fine a phrase of it, and allowing something that allows more building. I mean, in general, it's not as if making things easier for development needs to be a giveaway to developers. You can charge people impact fees. There's no reason why, if you have a clear price to charge people for doing things, you can't actually have this operate. But you really do want a system that isn't based on some crazy notion of a British garden city, which is the type of thinking that informed, it's like the last curse of British colonialism that they inflicted on Mumbai's, land use planning, that they had this sort of strange, 1.25 floor area ratio. And, it's just a terrible mistake. If you don't build up, you build out, and it just makes urban management more difficult. Now, that isn't to say that if I looked at the problems of Mumbai, I think that land use controls are the largest problem facing Mumbai. That's just not, or the megacities of Africa. It's not that it happens to be low-hanging fruit. It happens to be something which it's something that it's right to speak out against. But you want to think about it, that the poorest countries typically have the problems of water being the most severe problem, and that's a very difficult problem. It is typically an engineering problem. It's not a problem that you worry about, are we going to price water correctly? That's just not the issue. You just want to make sure that the water is clean and you're getting the waste out of there. And unfortunately, it's expensive. It's still expensive. As you move up the sort of level of development, you end up dealing with the problems of congestion and the problems of crime. Crime is fascinating, right? Because crime is partially a result of government, and indeed, really some part of the U.S. reduction in crime had to do with government interventions, although I am certainly a strong believer that much in the vicissitudes of crime has to do with social interactions that have nothing to do with government. And certainly, when you ask yourself why Mumbai feels safe, right? Even in very poor neighborhoods, Mumbai feels incredibly safe, and Rio de Janeiro does not. It's not because, I met no one in Mumbai who tells me that's because of the crackerjack Mumbai police force, right? It's that the community protects itself, right? It's the communities have eyes, and this is something that Jane Jacobs spoke so eloquently about, right? It's that the community, looks after its own. If there's a stranger there, they're all going to come out and watch the stranger. It's a social structure that works. Whereas Rio, that broke down. And that's obviously the second major function. And then you move beyond that, you're dealing with problems of congestion and other forms of basic social services. But I at least start with water and then move to safety. And then, of course, there's the question of how is it that you're going to deliver enough skills, because skills is fundamentally the bedrock of national and urban success. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for a wonderful lecture. I'm a visiting student from China, the city which was one of the most CO2 emission city, Beijing. So I have two questions. The first one is that how big is big enough for a city? There's a lot of arguments nowadays in China during the very quick urbanization. Like the Beijing, some people said that Beijing is not big enough. It should be another Tokyo, especially considering the Chinese economy and large population. But from the other perspective, there's a lot of problems raised nowadays in Beijing. The second question is that in the last several decades, a lot of cities try to create another Silicon Valley. They bring out a lot of policies to do that, but only few successful cases we can hear. So what do you think the relationship between the city agglomeration and the public policy? Thank you very much.
Great. Two fantastic questions. So the first question, actually, thanks for giving me a chance to explain this. So the darker dots are the more CO2 emissions per household. It's actually completely opposite than in the U.S. That actually, because in fact China heats, but it doesn't cool. So the most energy-intensive places in China tend to be the colder places to the north, whereas in the U.S. it's actually the humid areas in the deep south. And actually, one of the ironies of the U.S. policy is that the greenest places in the U.S. tend to be coastal California because of their very, very temperate climate, which you'd think that if you were an environmentalist who was worried a great deal about stopping global warming, then you'd be cheering for as much development on San Francisco Bay as you possibly could have, right? Because that's where America should be building if it wanted to become green. Of course, the environmental movement has been deeply hostile again, is building in San Francisco Bay. And that doesn't stop development. It just turns off the spigot there and then turns it on outside of Phoenix, or turns it on outside of Houston. So by moving development away from San Francisco to Houston, they're actually, by thinking globally, acting locally, they're actually, making the globe worse off. But the too big, what's too big? There's no right answer to that. There's just no right answer to that. By what's going on in terms of the local quality of life, by how the urban labor market is working. Typically, the larger the city, the more critical the public role is, right? And it's a question of how good congestion pricing makes things easier. Do you have a good bus rapid transit system that's actually working quite well? These are all the things that need to be asked. There's just no one right answer in terms of the city size thing. And I wouldn't either try to. It's hard because it doesn't fit into the Chinese system at all. And there's a reason why I don't write a lot about China in the book. But the sort of basic view that you want cities basically to compete. You want to certainly have a safety net for poor people, but you don't want to necessarily level the playing field against poor cities. And then you sort of see what comes out of the urban equilibrium. That sort of is a very natural framework. It's not a framework that's particularly relevant for the Chinese case, where there's much more of a centralized control over this. But I think it's still, even in the Chinese case, it's hard to talk about what's too big. Your other question is basically, it's about the Silicon Valleys and engineering them from the top. And there's a great book by Josh Lerner called Boulevard of Broken Dreams, which chronicles the general failure of attempts to sort of have pro-innovation, cluster policies in your area. It is clear that these clusters occur, that they're incredibly important, but most of the time, when local governments have tried to do it, they've been a colossal failure. And I think most of the time, industrial policy tends to be a failure. Right? Remember, in the 1980s, we were all obsessed about Japan and the U.S., and Japan had this great industrial policy, and that was what we needed. We needed to pick winners like MIDI did, and then Beeson and Weinstein ran the numbers. And MIDI, Japan's industrial policy center, they didn't pick winners. They picked losers. They were doing exactly what happens so often in industrial policy in the U.S. You're actually funneling money not towards the fast-growing industries, but you're funneling towards the ones that are in decline. And I think that's the sort of general message of this. Cities really aren't good, and countries aren't either in playing venture capitalist, right? The real policy is to try and attract and train smart people and then more or less get out of their way. And that is not a recipe for laissez-faire, because attracting and training smart people is incredibly hard, but it involves the basics of city government, like providing fast commutes and clean streets and safe streets and decent schools, all of which is an incredibly hard and intensive policy. The one case of industrial policy that actually one could argue about is Singapore. Like so many cases, Singapore's government is able to do things that seem utterly impossible in any other polities, like the fact that their public housing is, of course, a fantastic success, right? High-rise public housing is a fantastic success in Singapore, right? I mean, just from an American perspective, it's mind-boggling. My own view of why industrial policy in Singapore seemed to work is that it wasn't so much about picking winners as firms. It was about moving the population up the human capital chain. It was by moving them into, initially into textiles and then light electronics and then up the food chain. Lee Kuan Yew was essentially educating his people. And I think that's always how you should think about, if you're ever tempted to get engaged in industrial policy, ask about whether or not it would succeed as human capital policy. Are you actually, don't ask about how many jobs it's going to create this year. Ask about how much of gain in wages over the next 10 years you're actually going to get from this. And that's the right way to I think, evaluate this. Are you actually educating your people? Are you creating entrepreneurs in the long run? But certainly be very wary of cities that think that they can actually pick winners on this stuff. I think we have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
Thanks for coming in today. My question is that, cities are great places to live, and more people are moving into them, especially in the United States. Now, from my experience working for the Port Authority in New York, New Jersey, I know, I follow you on Bloomberg, so I know. Well, we've got really serious infrastructure problems in New York. Over the summer, we're working on the Holland Tunnel. It's 85 years old. I put my hands on the cracks. It's not a good thing. And in the Bronx, in the Kingsbridge section, about in August, we had a 100-year-old water main break. Now, I guess even with cities being a desirable place to live and, with more people moving into them, what do you think is going to be the tipping point where we start to seriously step up our investiture in infrastructure? And I don't mean just roads and stuff. I mean like tunnels, bridges, water infrastructure, that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely right. I do think, so when it comes to most forms of infrastructure, I'm actually a localist. I actually think the same. This is true about the Port Authority as well. I think the Port Authority has too many darn things on its plate, and there's no reason why. Take a simple example: why JFK Airport couldn't be. I mean, it has certain geographic problems that are difficult, but there are lots of people coming through it. It can generate enough revenues to make it the pride of the world. But there's just too much on the Port Authority's plate, I think, for them to actually manage it. I think actually having the feds involved in the infrastructure business is actually not helpful. I think actually the idea that, they fund things that are not, the redistribution across states I think is not helpful. The focus on what they're funding is not helpful. I think fundamentally it's cities and states need to actually pay for their own infrastructure with user fees as much as possible, if not that with property taxes. And you're right, part of the problem, of course, is that infrastructure is just expensive, right? And it's, New York at least has the economic base that if it got its political act together, it could pay for all this stuff. Particularly, it's somewhat problematic because of the multi-state nature, but it could pay. It has more than enough revenues in New York to actually generate it. In places like Detroit, it's far more extreme, right? You built infrastructure for twice as many people. The costs are still there. So, Mayor Bing is trying, in some sense, to shrink the physical size of the city, not by evicting people, but by basically drawing lines and saying, well, we're not going to provide a full range of city services outside of these areas, and we're going to help you relocate inside. It's hard to imagine how you do things other than that without something that's involving that shrinking. But I think it's really almost always true, particularly in infrastructure, that we overbuild and undermaintain. That we're, it's so much fun to cut a new ribbon on a fancy new thing, and it's not fun to actually deal with those cracks in the Holland Tunnel, and yet it's so crucial that we do so. So I don't know what the tipping point will be, but in terms of the policy implication, that paying attention to these maintenance issues and recognizing the enormous challenge ahead is crucial, and I am glad you're at the Port Authority. As easy it is it's really important work. So thank you for doing it. And okay, one more. Yes. Oh, this is like The Ringer. I was going to say something really.
Hello. So I have a question of the impact cities have on income inequality. Like it seems that on one hand, they are desirable places to be in, and if you are probably a young professional, you can take a hit in your wage, this premium you mentioned, to be able to live in a city. What happens if you're poor? Like, I mean, I've never been to Montana, but it would suck to end up living there just because you can't afford to live somewhere else.
So I think that the way to, cities are unequal places, but they're unequal places not because they're, at least I've seen very little evidence to suggest that they're actually producing inequality, at least not on the low end. There probably is a sense in which the cities are playing a causal role in generating the mega fortunes. But then again, the part of inequality that I've always worried about is the poverty. I'm not particularly upset that Bill Gates is a lot richer than I am. That doesn't in any way, he seems to be doing, I'm on the Gates Advisory Board, so but he seems to be doing a lot better things with his money than I am. So I don't feel particularly bad about that. But I think we do, in fact, worry about the bottom end. But at least the way I tend to think about, at least I think it's the right way of thinking about it, because when you look at urban inequality, it reflects the fact that cities are relatively good places to be rich, and they're not terrible places to be poor either, because you can actually get around without a car for every adult, because you have better social services than in the suburbs. The cities are, in fact, attracting poor people. Some of the work that I didn't discuss is my work with Matthew Kahn, trying to ask why is it that the poor live disproportionately in cities. And one of the facts that paper shows is that recent migrants to cities look about the same as pre-existing long-term stayers, which suggests that this is really about selection, not about treatment. And one of the other facts that the paper tries to establish is the strong connection between access to public transit and poverty. So when you get more access to public transit, as created by, let's say, this Federal Highway Aid Act metro systems, poverty rates in nearby tracts go up slightly. Small effect, but it goes up slightly. It doesn't mean that the transit systems are impoverishing people. It doesn't mean that the transit system is doing anything bad. It actually means they're doing exactly what you expect them to do, which is to provide a means of getting around without a car for poorer Americans. And this is possible if you live in Queens or you live in the Bronx in New York in a way that's not true if you live in Upper Westchester County. And that's something that cities should be relatively proud about. I think the problem with cities, the problem with urban inequality, at least as far as I look at it, is the missing middle. Is the fact that cities are managing to attract poor people, particularly immigrants, and are managing to attract and I think also create the very rich. But it's awfully hard to be a middle-income person in Manhattan, right? It's awfully hard. And one of the exercises that I do in the book is that I sort of compare what it would look like if you were sort of right in the middle of the American income distribution. Family income, $60,000, $70,000 a year, living in New York versus living in Houston. Right? And you're going to earn a little more in New York, but that disappears awfully quickly in the combination of housing prices and the other issues today with New York. It's not taxes; it's the sort of cost of living. And at the end of the day, you're 50% richer in sort of after tax, after income in Houston than you are in New York, and you probably have better schools unless your kids won the lottery and got into Hunter or Stuyvesant. And it's easy to understand why 1 million people have moved to Houston in the last 10 years. Now, that, again, has a lot to do with the fact that Houston makes it a lot easier to build, which enables the delivery of lots of high-quality, affordable housing. But to me, at least, when I look at the inequality of cities, the sort of thing that I feel for is the fact that we're doing such a bad job of making our cities livable for middle-income Americans that we create this donut. There's also a donut in terms of the age distribution, which, again, is reflecting in the schools issue, that sort of cities, young people, old people, but a missing middle as people sort of move to suburbs when they acquire kids. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Please join us in Strasser Common. We're going to have a reception, and Ed has been kind enough to agree to sign his book. The bookstore is here with copies of the book if you'd like to have a few minutes to talk to Professor Glaeser. Thanks again so much.